Hi, so I just wanted to show a quick example of how you might start to decorate your diagram that's outlining your design process. And I'm using the example from Shop Architects from their monograph of 2012 called Out of Practice. And it focuses on a diagram that they developed called Find the Right Tool. And so you see the diagram here on this profile page. If you click on it, you can see it a little larger. And it's a diagram showing their digital workflow, the tools they use, the relationships between those tools, and how they sort of share information from one element to one tool to another, and how they would sort of classify those different workflows and processes. And I would say that this is probably somewhat similar to how you operate. Maybe not as sophisticated with some of the sort of fabrication or file management or 4D workflow processes, but at least sort of the documentation, presentation, analysis, even to some extent, and complex geometry workflows might seem familiar to what you're doing on a regular basis with your design process in terms of operating in one tool. Perhaps it's Rhino, perhaps it's Revit, perhaps you model some information in one tool and need to share it between the other. This has actually gotten much easier in the 8 years since Shop produced this diagram, but at the time it was quite difficult in terms of moving this information around. And so the part of this diagram was just to help them sort of communicate and understand how they were working internally within the office, but how they needed to work on their projects. So I'm using this as an example of perhaps how you could start to document your own process for this first part A of project one. And it will be a good lead-in in terms of, or a good transitional example in terms of what it means to think about your process within the larger scope of the discipline itself as we look into in terms of expanding that role of collaborating with others, how you see your work fitting within that larger realm. So for the sake of just this example, though, this is the diagram that I'm trying to sort of base it on and be sort of inspired by. So you can see what I've developed is the elements themselves that match all of those various elements. So here you can see some of the presentation tools, the typical Adobe products, and then you can click on each of these. And if you look at the profile page, you'll see that I've actually started to give some additional information. So for instance, the type, which becomes a really powerful way to organize your elements and classify your elements, and we'll see in terms of decorating your elements, becomes something very important to make sure you try to utilize, especially for the data-driven decoration processes, which I'll be showing you briefly. But you can see that, Photoshop I'm listing as a software. You could call it a tool, whatever, just as long as you understand what this classification means. And you could add as many types of values you would want for these types, as long as they're all unique. So, and then we'll see shortly why that's really helpful, especially when you want to try to sort of make the data meaningful and legible to understand. You can see I've also added an image file, and this is simply an image that is, I've pasted the URL. You'll see if I click in here, I just found the URL online and pasted a link to the URL of that image, and it simply reads it directly into Kumu, which is very handy. Now, it's not showing up on the tag yet, but we'll see how we can handle that shortly. So this becomes very handy in terms of how to start to organize the data and display it different ways. And you're not limited to just simply by this type. We'll see that you can actually add any number of fields you want. So by default, I believe each element that you create has an image file as a default field. But you can actually start to add any additional fields you would want. You simply give it a name, give it a value, and you can organize this information. You can use these as ways to organize and parse the information. You can also go, if you want to add a lot of fields, you can start to add new fields within your project homepage as well, which becomes really handy, especially if you want to set up some of the information ahead of time, if you know how you begin to organize it. So what I was just looking at was element type, right? So I have software, process, workflow, tool, output, right? These are fairly arbitrary in terms of what you name them. You can name them whatever you want. It's just something that will help you in terms of how you start to organize this information, and think about it specifically in terms of how you want to think about and organize your process. The element type becomes really important, the connection type as well. You could start to name these whatever you want to give some variation to that. So we'll just go back to the map, and you can see I've gone through and I've created basically all the elements that correspond to the diagram, the shop architect's diagram itself. I've stayed pretty true to it. I added a couple variations by actually listing Dynamo and Grasshopper as two parametric workflows or tools related to Rhino and Revit. Grasshopper was pretty new at the time that Shop developed that workflow. Dynamo didn't exist yet. So they typically just labeled it as generic parametric software, but that's sort of the connection I'm trying to make, right? That these are, so that's my one little variation from the diagram that I did. Otherwise, you can see I'm pretty true. The only other thing too is I actually split out Excel and Access, Excel being a spreadsheet software, Access being a database software. Both can be used sort of basically as databases. And sometimes they're used interchangeably, but I just for clarity, I wanted to separate them out. Same with Robot and Strand, both structural analysis software, but I just decided to, for the sake of clarity, separate those out as tools, as individual tools. And then some of the tools that have now changed names slightly, like Building Explorer by Graphisoft is now called BIMX. I just kind of put the updated name in there as well. But otherwise, I've tried to stay sort of pretty true to the shop architect's diagram. Some of these tools don't exist anymore. Ecotech is no longer its own software. Sort of the technologies was acquired by Autodesk and sort of folded into, I believe, into Revit pretty much. And some of the daylighting analysis and things like that you can do is basically, I think, relies upon the Ecotech engine and software developed at that time. And you can see that I've also made little elements here for things like these titles. Now they're not connected to anything, and we want them to look differently, obviously, than the elements, and we'll talk a little bit about how we can start to do that. So one thing you might want to try to do is first say, all right, here I have all the data in here, and I've started to give it some additional information, but how can I start to make it look like even just like the shop architect's diagram, right? And this is where the power of the rule-based decoration becomes really important. So if we open up the settings bar, you'll see that how we can start to actually decorate this information is through what's called your view. So right now I'm in this sort of blank raw data view, which is really just looking at the information in its sort of most generic and raw form, right? Literally elements and connections, and sort of in their default raw form, which, while is helpful in terms of understanding the connections between all of these things, at a first glance, it's not very visually appealing, and it lacks sort of the clarity that even exists in this sort of static diagram that Shop developed. So we could start to at least step it up a notch and get it looking sort of like how Shop developed theirs, right? Which is more like this. And you can see I'm now at least, there's a little bit more clarity in terms of what are primary tools in terms of, doing most of their work probably in the Rhino Revit world, and being able to share information between those. So the size of those elements obviously is indicative of the importance of their those as tools in their process. And even the connections in between carry a little bit more visual weight than the other connections that exist between that software and other tools. Also, the fact that there's color variation between some of these, right, might imply tools that are meant more for design and presentation, and then tools that are meant more for analysis. And so that, that becomes something that you might want to start to even differentiate amongst your diagrams that you might be developing and trying to better understand your own workflow. So how did I start to at least get this to look a little bit like the Shop version? Well, again, this is where it's starting to get some additional metadata associated with these, right? So Rhino, again, the type software becomes really important, and you can start to decorate things just purely based on that. But all I did here was you can also add some description information, right? This is literally just cut and paste from Wikipedia to talk about what the tool is. And then you can even have a link to the website there if you want to go find more information. You can start to, here I added a field called workflow, which starts to put it in different workflow categories. I don't know if that's actually accurate. I would probably call it more computer-aided design or modeling software, right? But you can adjust that all you want. The other important field I added, which was size, and it's just a generic field I created of type, type number. And you'll see that becomes important in terms of being able to physically change the size of it. Now, just by giving it that name didn't change the size. What I needed to do was actually set up a rule that said anything that had that size should be made bigger than all of the other elements. So some of the decorations that I started to do, which is what they call it, is, and you can do this several different ways in Kumu. The most straightforward or most, the most painless is using their sort of interface where you would go under the more options, and you can start to go in and decorate elements differently, decorate connections. You can customize some default view things. So here's where you could start to play with even just the connection with itself of individual things. I'm not going to save that change, but what's really useful is when you actually start to set up some of the rules. So here's where you could say, so for all elements where size is equal to 500, which is what that one was, I want to do something. And you can see that this is the criteria, and it's matched to elements, which are the two elements, Rhino and Revit. And this is where I could then say change the size. I could give it some physical number. I could scale it based on some field if I wanted to, right? So here's where I could say, well, scale it based on the size value by some multiplier. I could change the color. I could add images. I could start to do all sorts of interesting things based on this criteria, and it will set up the rule only for those elements that match that particular criteria. So once you do that, what starts to happen is you start to develop behind the scenes, you start to develop these rules that you can start to see now in this advanced editor. And this is where I feel Kumu is really powerful, because you can do all that stuff through clicking the interface, and it's really great. But once you start to realize what it's doing behind the scene, you'll find that getting here in this advanced editor, you can make changes and play around with that a lot easier. So here's the criteria I just set up, where it's basically saying for all elements where size equals 500, so that's the syntax for doing that, do what's in this block. So it's saying make the size of that element, right, equal to 250, right? And this is equal to This is different than the default, which I set up as the default size up here for 100. So I didn't, when there's no threshold criteria, it does it for all elements. And you can see if I change this now to 200, you can see any element that's sort of just a generic element meets that criteria. Well, I don't want to do that. I want to go back and make them 100. So that already upped the size of them. Also, you can see I've added a border, a width on the border, a color, a font size, so it's more legible. I've turned off, I don't want it to show the images that I've associated with all of those, and I made the color transparent. I can make the color, I can make the color anything I want here. So let's say I wanted all those to be blue, right? But I just have it transparent for, again, legibility especially when I'm including images, and you'll see that briefly. So you'll see there, I've set up here a few rules where, for instance, here's basically all the generic elements. Then here's where I've created elements that I've labeled as workflow, which are these guys up here. You can see if I pick on one of these, I've labeled this as type workflow, right? And that's simply because I wanted it to be something that I could easily select, right? So all of these guys, and then you can start to see I've now made it into a shape rectangle. Well, the default shape for elements inside of Kumu are circles, but you can actually make rectangular and square elements, which it uses for some of its other templates. And so you can actually use it within the systems diagram as well. And that becomes really powerful for doing things like this, where you want it to be almost like a title. And so again, I'm able to literally mimic what that initial diagram looked like by basically giving that element a name of 4D5D, right? Well, it says 4D5D workflow. How did I do that? Well, anything that I've labeled a workflow, I've parsed it out and said, make that rectangular of certain dimensions, add the label where you include the label, which is the element name itself, and you can add any text after it. So here I added workflow. I could say workflow extreme or something. I can add any text I want to that additionally, and you'll see that all of those elements that are of that type automatically get updated, right? And so again, here's where, setting up these rules, setting up the control of the information becomes really powerful. Here's where I included the font size, the font color, the border color, so that they're a little lighter gray. They feel like they're more sort of in the background. And actually, there's a way to literally make them in the background. I can add that right here, where I say layer is background. And if I do that, now I can't click on those elements. They are literally sort of on a frozen background layer, which can be helpful, especially for if I'm trying to look through this map and I want those elements to always be there and not fade away when you're sort of trying to let Kumu sort of help you by parsing out some of these information, seeing the connectivity, right? So again, you can see that that's really helpful. Now what's tricky is you physically can't move them anymore. So you would need to, if you had to edit your diagram at all, after you've done that, you'd have to delete that, or there's ways to comment out just certain lines. And now I can go there and I could move it and adjust it if need be, right? So again, this becomes extremely powerful ways to visualize the data, visualize the relationships, visualize the system maps that you start to develop. And so you can see that with just a few series of rules, I went from, close this out, let me close the rules out. I went from this diagram of just blank raw data, elements and connections to what basically pretty darn close to what the shop architect's diagram was. And then I took it one step further personally, because while I think this is useful, I think there is ways to even improve it a little bit more. And then I added, which basically was just adding all of the some logos and icons to represent the different software, right? So you still have the name, so you can still, if you don't know what all the logos are, you can still read it. But at a quick glance, you can really start to understand the different softwares they're using, how they share information between those software, and where they would classify each of those software existing within their larger workflow. And again, what's really great about this is you can, click on one, hover over one element, and you can it'll start to gray out everything that's not related and not connected to that, either directly or indirectly. And you can really start to understand how this workflow sort of exists and connected between all of these different tools, seemingly independent and disparate tools. And this is where you can then again start to add even additional descriptions and metadata that you might want to use for just keeping track of, or just even communicating to yourself or to others about your process, right? So here, some of these I didn't get in and actually add descriptions on, but again, once you have the model set up, you can quickly go back and do some of that stuff, right? But you can even add images if you want to show people, what this one's not showing up for some reason, the Excel screenshot. But you could start to, get pretty creative in terms of what information you're sharing and how you can communicate this system, this pretty complex relationship of elements to one another, and how when you share that map with somebody else, how they might understand your project and your process. So again, this is perhaps maybe, more complex of a relationship than you might develop for your own process. But I just wanted to show it as an alternative to the very, I think, overly simplified workflow, circular workflow that I had showed the other day, where this gets into, again, a little bit more of the tools, techniques that one might use when sort of designing a building and thinking about the relationship of how you go from sort of modeling to documentation to presentation, how you deal with complex geometry, how you maybe analyze that for performative aspects, how you might share that for some analysis from a 4D construction workflow, which again is beyond the scope of what we do in school as architects, but is things to be thinking about as in terms of the value of why we develop these models in the first place. And then even to the point of thinking about your fabrication workflow. So again, there's pieces of this that I would imagine exists in all of your workflows in one form or another, even if it's things like 3D printing and laser cutting for small physical models, right? So hopefully you'll find this helpful in terms of how you can start to just again document your own process, but then begin to communicate it to others as well. And here is where, again, you can start to think about how you can share and embed this map. So once you create an embed, you can either copy the link, and I think this works as well. If you just copy the link directly into Canvas, it will drop it right in. Or if you go through the HTML editor, you can actually just drop in the iframe text, and that will work as well. But I believe it, let's just copy this. Let's just test it out. And if you go to, just going to make a generic page, you would be doing this obviously through your posting. But if you just paste that in, I believe, you hit enter. Let's see. Oops. I might have spoken too soon. Yes, and that's just the link. So let's not do that. I was just testing that. I guess it's better to actually copy this iframe text. And then when you go to HTML edit mode down here, and then when you click back and switch back, you'll see it'll preview. That's a quick way to test it. It'll preview whatever that is set up, right? And so now I'm going to save that. And it's live, right? This is a live access to that diagram, right? So you can edit, you can zoom around, you can focus on one element, step through and see how they're all related. You can close this window out, go full screen again. By default, it doesn't allow you to scroll zoom, and a way to change that is just a really easy line of code that I believe right after the embed link, you just simply do, what is it, question mark scroll equals 1, and then save that. Let's try that now. Now, yes, now I can physically scroll within the window itself, which is perhaps much easier in terms of being able to zoom and move around, right? And so here is your live Kumu model embedded in Canvas. So you can post this as part of your assignment or into the discussion page if you have any questions about things. And again, I would just encourage you to spend some time playing around with it, spend some time looking at these quick tip videos themselves are really helpful. Now, again, it's overwhelming because there's 30 of them here, but again, just if you look at this sort of side window here, you can really kind of quickly figure out things that might be most useful to you. And some of this is way beyond what we're going to do, but how do I color code elements, right? I mean, that's a great start. Even if you just wanted to, rather than having the images in there, you could just color code them by the different types you'd want to do. And that's actually really easy rules to set up, which again becomes really important why you would start to classify those different elements as different types, especially when you want to start to visualize that data. As we get into much more complex data, we might find that organizing it in the spreadsheet and being able to drop it in there pretty easily might become really helpful. But for this first one, just getting in there and clicking around and adding some elements and making some connections between them, I think is what sort of an important start. Another piece which is going to be really interesting that as we move forward through the term and especially into next term is building presentations with these models. So we'll see that there's ways that you can actually start to unfold the data and information and the relationships really fluidly and start to actually develop a presentation that anybody can start to step through what appears to be your very complex and illegible model and start to understand where one even starts and how one might move through this different information. So hopefully this was at least a little helpful sort of introduction to what some diagram you might be working on might look like. Again, I've added this example under resources for the project, example, find the right tool, where I've even added a little image of the book that it comes from, the full size image, and then here's the embedded Kumu model itself, which you can start to then play around with and click and do things with. So have a look at that, have some fun. Hopefully, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me and let me know. I will be having office hours again tomorrow night, Wednesday night from 7 to 8. So again, if you're having any problems with this, feel free to drop in and I'm happy to sort of troubleshoot anything that you might be encountering. So have fun and I'll see you guys on Friday. Thanks.